Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in, logging on, joining us for this second webinar of the 2020 Upper Mississippi River webinar series. It's our whole new world here, and so we're online and going to try to share some knowledge. Want to recognize our sponsors for the series: Ashton Engineering, City of Moline, the Mark Schwiebert Fund for Environmental Studies, Big River Magazine, and the Nature Conservancy. It's extremely helpful to have these sponsors to help us keep doing what we are doing, and they're all usually helping us out when we have an actual in-person conference as well. So please keep these sponsors in mind and patronize if you can or when you can. So today we have an interesting presentation. And our speaker today is Matt Fockler from Augustana College. Matt is an associate professor and historical geographer at Augustana College in Rock Island. His research explores public land management and resource use. He has written historical and cultural geography of water management on the Truckee River and a historical geography of Forest Service landscapes in the crown of the ecosystem in northern Montana. His current research, To Mississippi, is a historical geography of the Upper Mississippi River since the Great Depression. So I'm going to flip the screen to get Matt up here. And there we go. There we go. Now we gotta get. Okay, Matt, if you are ready to go.
All right. Well, thank you, Carol. Thank you all for having me here. But before I even share another word, I want to just thank some people and organizations, including the sponsors here for this series, but some people and organizations who have helped made this research possible. I received a grant from the Mark W. Schwiebert Fund for Environmental Studies, and that's allowed me really some financial freedom to pursue this research. And that's included hiring students to work with me on this project and on their own sub-related topics. Augustana College has generously supported this research, both financially and with gear. A lot of this research can only be done from the river, and I will always be grateful for the Augie Geography Department that they've allowed me to pilot its boats. I would also like to thank the Rock Island District of the United States Army Corps, especially librarian Bob Romick and supervisory natural resource specialist Joe Lund. Well, it's an honor to speak at the Upper Mississippi River Conference, and I'm proud to share this web space with so many amazing speakers. We all approach this amazing place differently. I'm a historical geographer in Rock Island, Illinois, and my perspective and that of this presentation is that of a historical geographer, meaning that I explore how place evolves over time. This project, titled To Mississippi, examines change over time on the Upper Mississippi River since the Great Depression. In other words, this project examines the Upper Mississippi River since the river underwent its greatest man-made change, since it changed from a mostly free-flowing river to a series of pools or slackwater lakes. But I'm getting ahead of myself here with that. So let me scan over here. I want to take a second here to talk to you about the tools that historical geographers use to do their work. As a geographer, of course, it's sacrilege not to use historic maps as a keystone of your research. Historic maps tell you a great deal of information, but they are pretty selective. They tell you the story only that what the cartographer, that the story that the cartographer wanted to tell, which can be pretty important and interesting on its own. But to add to that, we use more modern mapping techniques when they're available. And like you see here, in this case, I've overlaid some historic aerial photos with current digital imagery in a geographic information system, or GIS. We also use this type of technology to analyze change over time in landscapes. I use geostatistical interpolation to fill in the gaps, and this allows me to predict the surfaces and estimates of value of data in other locations on the study area. This allows me to represent the past and present human and ecological landscapes with some statistical certainty. Well, historical geographers make great use of archives. We use the archives to supply answers to and ask questions of our historic landscapes. This project began in the Rock Island District Army Corps Library Archives. I've also spent weeks combing the National Archives in Chicago and Kansas City, and I've been in pretty much every county courthouse and historical society up along the Mississippi River looking for archival data for this project. Oral histories and interviews bring the archives to life and reconnect people to the historic landscape. Throughout this research, I've been able to connect with several families impacted by the change in the Mississippi, or the 9-foot project, as we'll call it. And I hope to talk to more. So if any of you out there are connected to this landscape, consider this an open invitation. We'll talk more about that later. The final piece of this puzzle is fieldwork. Fieldwork for a historical geographer can take many forms. In Mississippi, fieldwork involves a technique that we call repeat photography. Repeat photography begins with an initial photo from a particular vantage point. This photo may be taken for a variety of reasons. It may be something that a landscape photo that of a spectacular area, or could be used for some sort of scientific analysis there. This photo taken in Yosemite, was one of a grand landscape taken in the late 19th century. Repeat photography continues when someone returns to that exact spot and repeats the process. And by observing the change over time, we can assess landscape change and even plot a trajectory of change. In this case, we can see what happens when beaver dams back up a creek and slowly transform the landscape into a marshy prairie. The United States, the USGS and the National Park Service recognized a decade ago that repeat photography could be a powerful tool for resource land managers. It is just simply a powerful tool to visualize change over time, and one that has real power to draw in the public, and it invites them to engage with places past and present. We see it on signage in our public wayfinding interpretive signs and in educational packets put together, in this case by the National Park Service in Glacier National Park. And there are even websites like History Pin that crowdsource historic photos. This website encourages people to go out and to conduct their own repeat photography in place. And there's other ones too that do repeat photography to try and get people to document their own personal histories. So take a break a little bit from repeat photography here, and I want to tell you a little bit about myself as a way into this project, and then we'll get to the good stuff here. I was born out west in Nevada, and until I moved from the west to the banks of the Mississippi River 7 years ago, this really was my vision of a river. The Mississippi and big rivers and big water was a totally foreign place to me. And so to better understand the river and the place that I now live in, I took a part-time job bartending on a riverboat, and some of you may recognize this one. That's what I bartended on. And I'd look out of my window as we were going on our cruises, as the house band played another cover of a Celine Dion number, and I'd watch the shore roll by. Those forests and shorelines that separated us from roads and cornfields, and I just couldn't help but wonder who owned them. They felt almost impenetrable to me, like no one had ever been there. And for a guy from Nevada, man, I felt like a lot like Huck Finn. And we'd share the river with barges and tows. Each tow pushed up to 15 barges at a time, and I learned that each barge held the equivalent of, almost 60 semi-trucks of rock and scrap iron and fertilizer. And so that a 15 barge tow, which was really common, pushes the equivalent of 870 semi-trucks up and down the river. And of course, on longer trips, we'd go through the locks, and the locks and dams are necessary on the Mississippi, because really the Mississippi is not a naturally deep river. The barges need at least 9 feet of channel depth to navigate, and historically, especially on the upper Mississippi, 4 feet of depth was pretty difficult to maintain. But for decades, the Army Corps of Engineers and other public and private groups attempted to maintain a 4.5 foot and then a 6 foot and then a 6.5 foot deep channel in the upper Mississippi. They utilized wing and closing dams, seen here, wing dams, which are piers of rock and stone that force water into the main channel. The force of this water creates a scouring effect. And they also use dredging. The Army Corps has been pulling sand and gravel from the bottom of the upper Mississippi for well over a century. And though the Corps and other groups worked to maintain a channel, they couldn't guarantee adequate depth. As this graph shows, spring flood pulses tapered off in the productive summer and fall months, just when farmers needed the river to move grain and farm product to the Gulf. By 1920, most product actually was shipped via railroad, which created its own issues. Price gouging and monopolies squeezed farmers and commercial interests along the river. Meanwhile, depth wasn't an issue at all, really, south of St. Louis. A 9-foot depth was easily obtained after the Missouri and Ohio rivers poured into the channel. Barges from around the world picked up and dropped off goods at the Gulf of Mexico ports and along the lower Miss. Traffic on the upper Mississippi could be at a near standstill, especially in drought years. It was just easier to ship goods via rail and load them onto boats in St. Louis than to deal with the temperamental upper Mississippi. And so, by the late 1920s, after a devastating 1927 flood and a decade-long farm crisis, the time was right for a federal reordering of the river. Engineer and soon-to-be President Herbert Hoover called upon the Army Corps to flex its high modernist muscle and to create a systematic navigation system on the upper Mississippi River. But it wasn't until the Great Depression that it actually happened. New Deal funding provided the federal largesse and the manpower to alter the river. And so between 1930 and 1940, the Army Corps of Engineers constructed 26 lock and dam facilities on the upper Mississippi River. It converted 550 miles of free-flowing river into a staircase of water and the upper Mississippi into a series of slackwater lakes that we call navigation pools. The 9-foot project, as it came to be known, raised water levels to that 9-foot minimum necessary for global commercial barge traffic. As we see here, again, the average levels before the project and then after. These next images show average water levels per month in 20-year periods up to 2019. This is one way we can see the effect of the 9-foot project and Army Corps management. It's significant to notice the high and low water levels. We rarely ever drop below a 9-foot level, but that 9-foot level acts like a platform, and that contributes to higher water events like we've experienced these last couple of decades. Well, in the months leading up to the 9-foot project, the Army Corps documented the social and ecological condition on the upper Mississippi floodplain. They created an amazingly comprehensive map set. It's really accurate for its time with 1-foot contour lines. And they used this to help calculate just how much of this floodplain would be inundated by these new normal water levels. They calculated a 2-year flood recurrence interval and then added another kind of 3 feet of elevation as a buffer. And any structure or land that fell within that interval was placed under Army Corps control through eminent domain condemnation proceedings. And in the process, the Army Corps became the largest public land manager on the Mississippi River corridor. For the 9-foot project, the Army Corps claimed approximately 93,000 acres in the Rock Island District alone through purchase and condemnation. About half of that remains more or less permanently underwater. The remaining 40,000 plus acres are the Army Corps' public land on this stretch of the Upper Mississippi. And we don't often think of the Army Corps as a public lands manager. On public land maps, the Army Corps is really nowhere to be seen, even though the Army Corps manages over 12 million acres of United States public land. And mostly that's because the Army Corps public lands exist on the margins of water projects, of reservoirs and rivers. They are the product of eminent domain, the product of federal purchasing power. They are almost always linear and they are ringed by private landowners. But there's another thing that obscures the Army Corps as a public land manager, and that's its very management imperative. The Army Corps prioritizes navigation and flood mitigation. And so in many ways, the Army Corps is a public land management agency that hasn't historically prioritized land management, although that is changing now. And in fact, it's been the policy of the Army Corps to, in a sense, almost cede much of their land management action to other federal and state agencies. And this can lead to a really kind of scattershot mosaic of management on their landscapes. Well, so along with drawing maps, as the Army Corps prepared for the 9-foot project, they sent out crews of photographers. They took thousands and thousands of photos, these photographers did, up and down the Upper Mississippi. These photos were entered into evidence in the condemnation proceedings and were used to gauge the value and ultimately to lay claim of the land. These photos were taken on the eve, almost literally in some case, of the Upper Mississippi's largest man-made alteration. And so as such, these photos become a visual benchmark. They capture a particular view of the Upper Mississippi River landscape, one that gives us a view of the regional environmental and cultural conditions on the Upper Mississippi during the Great Depression prior to the 9-foot project. Historical geographers, we call this a 1491 moment. So thinking about like a 1492 thing there, a 1491 moment, which is an opportunity to view a world before monumental change. So in this project, To Mississippi, I start with these historic photos, nearly 2,000 of them just from pool 15 to pool 18. And I mine these photos for dozens of social and ecological conditions, from understory cover to canopy structure and density to human land use. And that data is entered into a database, which I then put into a GIS, a Geographic Information System. And what that does is that gives at that particular point, that particular photo, an array of attributes or descriptions. I use both GIS and GPS to help me locate where the photo was taken, and then I reoccupy that place 80 years or more after the original photo was shot. And I photograph it from the same angle and the same vantage point as the original photographer. Since the far majority of these photos were taken in winter and leaf-off conditions, I do the same, and so it gets pretty cold. And then I put the reshot photo through that same data mining process. That data is then analyzed in the GIS using geostatistical interpolation and point density analysis. And as such, I can query the database for hundreds of social and ecological combinations. This allows me to assess trajectories, and it allows me to really see how the way that the landscape is evolving under Army Corps management. In this way, this research can hopefully aid and influence future management. The repeat photography process also creates a visual display of change, one that invites the viewer into the landscape and asks them to make their own assessments of that landscape, of that change over time. I had a hard time actually finding this photo. Here, my computer catches up, sorry. Come on. Apologies here, my computer is lagging. There we go. I was going to say I had a hard time actually finding this photo, this little chicken coop here. Oh boy, out there. And it wasn't until I stumbled around and I noticed a pile of chicken wire over in the corner there in the photo, and I realized that there was a small little pile of what I thought were just weeds. And it turned out, of course, that was that pile of chicken wire still kind of there after 80 years. And it allowed me to find exactly where that photo was there. And there it was. All right, well, I want to spend the rest of my time here exploring the upper Mississippi with you. Some of this and more can be found on my website, which is two-mississippi.com. We'll talk more about that later, and I'll link to it again at the end. But I invite you to explore the site. Okay, let's go. So when I go out to do research, I go out without a predefined idea about what I might find. I feel that keeps me open to seeing things that I might not otherwise notice. It makes me feel oftentimes like I'm the first person out there. I'm the first person to see these landscapes since the original photographer. Sorry, I'm lagging here. Well, I'll say there, as my computer struggles to catch up here for some reason, that it's actually quite a thrill when I do get the opportunity to go out as I'm walking through these areas there. When you realize that you're standing in the same spot of some of these photographers, and I'm looking through the lens just as they did. And so when you approach repeat photography from that perspective, you're forced to often figure out ways to make sense of what you're seeing. Okay, here we go. Okay, so when you approach repeat photography from that perspective, that open perspective, you're forced to figure out ways to make sense of what you're seeing. Of course, one way to do that is the geostatistical data and the GIS. My ultimate goal for this research is a book, and books require chapters, and chapters require organization. So I'd like to walk you through the changes that I've seen through the lens of that organizational structure. And I'll begin with the chapter called the Transformed Ecological Landscape. The 9-foot project initiated an ecological shift on the banks of and islands of the upper Mississippi River. Historically, the upper Mississippi River floodplain forest consisted of stands, which, and I quote here from Yeager from 1949, consisted of stands varying from saplings to mature growth that contained scores of very large, decadent, and often dying maples, with an occasional elm, sycamore, and oak of similar type. Maple gave way to elm, pecan, hackberry, cedar, cottonwood, ash, and oak, and walnut at higher elevations, where spring floods receded to dry summer soil. Ground cover was dominated by species that performed well under wet conditions, but oftentimes the upper Mississippi forest was somewhat savanna-like, with open spaces interspersing stands, and kind of similar to what you might see in this photo here. Well, in this photo set, we need to understand that the cleared area in the foreground is a product of road maintenance, of manual labor. In the background lies the wet ground, areas where high water tends to stand and pool in the spring. Floodplain forests are the product of disturbance, competition, and succession. A disturbance such as an annual spring flood or late summer fire clears the ground and prepares the soil for seeds. In the case of flood, the most critical disturbance on the upper Mississippi, the spring pulse, and I want to focus on that word pulse there, used to give way to dry summers and falls. Last year's acorns and walnuts, overwintered and cracked by below freezing temperatures, soften with the flood and find fertile, silty soil to root in. That flood pulse, and again, I mean a pulse, which is much different than a general kind of wetness that happens when water levels are managed and kept high, can kill off competitors and keeps the forest floor relatively clear of debris. Maple trees take advantage of that disturbance. Maples drop their helicopter seeds in the spring as floodwaters are at their highest. They float in the millions and fall gently with the water. Young maple saplings sprout early in the summer, a true competitive advantage. And if oaks and other nut-bearing trees want to compete, they need that traditional disturbance pattern. Floods need to pulse and not stand. And in part because the floodwaters are allowed to stand in the 9-foot project, the 9-foot project has transformed the ecological upper Mississippi landscape. The data shows distinct change in the upper Mississippi forest, including an expansion of monoculture canopy and a lack of structure. So let's talk a little bit about the monoculture canopy. The monoculture canopy is the result of continual flooding. So continual flooding has had a dramatic impact on the diversity of the upper Mississippi River forests. In some places, especially where high water stands longest, little to no forest diversity exists, and therefore results in a monoculture. In some places, if you notice here in this photo, there's a levee in the background of the photo. This area was historically a pasture, a sign that it was probably naturally too wet for crops, and there was a lot of farming in this part of Louisa County. Well, now maple have replaced the mix of nut and seed-bearing oak, and this is the photo of that spot there. Maples outcompete nut-bearing trees in these kinds of wet environments. They close the canopy as well and therefore exacerbate the wet soil conditions. These monoculture forests are spectacular in the fall. They're full of yellows and reds and oranges, and in the winter they're silent and foggy. You rarely see any signs of animals in these types of monoculture forests. There's nothing for them really to eat after all. The monoculture forest is especially prevalent on lands that were historically disturbed by human land use, usually by farming and settlement. Again, maple seeds take advantage of tilled earth. They take root early in the spring and ultimately shade out hardwood species. And they can leaving rather open stands. In this photo that is coming up here, again, as soon as my computer catches up here, you'll notice the lack of really any young trees in this forest. They simply can't compete, and this leaves the forest vulnerable and less resilient to change. This is kind of a classic example of a monoculture forest that you see quite a bit out in the floodplain. And this, is exactly what I mean by a lack of structure. A healthy forest has a diverse and mixed structure, meaning it has a nice distribution of trees across the spectrum. Old giants, stately and mature middle-aged trees, strong and developing adults, young and malleable saplings, and precious and vulnerable seedlings. Data mined from the repeat photography process combined with field observations and supported by the literature show that repeated flooding has significantly reduced the structure diversity of the upper Mississippi. While older and larger trees fare better, saplings and seedlings are actually pretty rare. After large flood events, maple trees dominate and they become really the only seedlings in the forest. Maple trees are highly adapted to flood disturbance on the upper Mississippi River. And so ultimately what this means is that the forest is getting older, at least as far as the more traditional nut-bearing trees. And there isn't a lot coming up to take its place. Sometimes it's easiest to see this structural change when you look out at the islands. As construction began on the lock and dam systems, the Army Corps turned its gaze on the island willow bars and shoreline mixed canopy forests. They were a problem. Floodwaters had pulled trees down into the channels, into the path of cargo ships. Massive oaks and walnuts could not be allowed to clog the lock and dam features, and the Corps knew that rising water levels would shake more of these giants down as the river settled into its new normal. They had to come down, and so by 1939, the Army Corps had hired locals to cut trees and willows, and had denuded large portion of the shoreline and island forests. In Pool 18, where this photo was taken, most of the forest was cleared between Keithsburg and the Mill Creek pumping plant. But the trees grew back. In many cases, rather than a mixed canopy of nut-bearing hardwoods, these new forests were predominantly silver maple. Again, maple seeds fall in the late spring, just as the flood waters usually recede, and their helicopter tails make them buoyant. And as the water drops, millions of maple seeds rest on recharged soil and sprout. Millions of maple seedlings shade out the occasional oak, acorn, or walnut pod, and within a year, a monoculture canopy of silver maple trees emerge. Nut-dependent animals soon leave the area, as do predators who depend on nut-dependent animals. When the leaves turn color, it can feel like you're in a golden fantasy land when you're walking through these forests. But in the winter, these monoculture maple forests are often free of any sound or any animal signs. This photo is of Willow Bar Island, and in the fall, it's all gold. Well, I've noticed other greater evidence of invasive species in the ground cover in the repeat photography, especially in some key locations, again, where humans have disturbed the landscape. And so we'll move forward into this next section here. Invasive and exotic plants are the ultimate competitors. Lacking natural controls such as fire, resilient to high water, invasives have exploded on the upper Mississippi River shores. This is particularly evident in places where human agricultural and recreational activity was present along shorelines. Along the upper Mississippi, it is easy to find, glossy buckthorn, spotted knapweed, Amur honeysuckle, leafy spurge, reed canary grass, multiflora rose, and of course, kudzu, which has so thoroughly overtaken the disturbed areas on this island. Invasives spread easily and at will. Buckhorn and honeysuckle berries are full of seeds. They are lovely lures for songbirds, but they're also laxatives. Birds gorge themselves on the berries and then spread the seeds wide and far. Multiflora rose grows in long snaking canes. It's often and well described as a living fence. It readily invades disturbed areas due to its high tolerance for a variety of conditions. The plentiful seeds, an average plant produces up to 1 million seeds per year, remain viable in the soil for up to 20 years and are readily dispersed by birds. Multiflora rose is the bane of my existence. Sorry, my computer is buffering right now. Okay, here we go. Well, the 9-foot project has contributed to forest and cover density changes. In some places, forest and the understory cover has actually grown in density, creating a jumbled landscape of living and dead trees. This tangled landscape is exacerbated by the lack of wildfire or managed prescribed burns, which is difficult to do in damp, often flooded forests. Fallen trees and overgrown forests slow and stall floodwaters. They become literal dams and collect human trash and floating debris, as we'll see here. However, in some cases, the frequent floods have cleared the landscape and have opened up the canopy and the understory. Okay, so shoreline loss, like I said, is a major management problem for the Army Corps. Island soil fills the channels and trees fall and become hazard. Habitat in a place is lost forever. To combat shoreline loss, the Army Corps wraps its islands with rock riprap. But they can't do that everywhere, and this kind of erosion is especially magnified out in the channel where the shore is continually and repeatedly battered by wakes and waves. And so here, at the edge of this working river's main channel, we see the 9-foot project's dramatic transformational ability. The 9-foot project eats islands. The channel side of nearly every upper Mississippi island is eroding at an extraordinary rate. From a habitat perspective, this can be considered a moderate disaster. It's problematic for the Corps, of course. Islands disintegrate and fill the channel with sand and silt and trees. And so the work of the channel, of maintaining the channel, of keeping the channel open for barge commerce, creates a need for channel maintenance. In some cases, however, the shorelines and islands are growing. In some cases, the shorelines and islands are growing. The upper Mississippi is a sediment transport system. Sand, clay, and silt from 1,000 tributaries flow through the upper Mississippi. Slow water sorts and sifts and eventually deposits the sediment. And the 9-foot project dams slow the river. Each pool repeats a pattern. At the top of the pool, furthest away from the next dam, the water flows with greater speed. It picks up sediment and carries it suspended in the water column. By the mid-pool, the water slows. Heavier sands fall out of the column and are deposited on shorelines and in the channel. At the end of the pool, near the dam, the water slows even more and the silt and clay stack up. Islands and sandbars grow, especially around Army Corps wing dams and water control structures. In the photos here, we see a shoreline cabin. In the distance is a small sandbar. The repeat photo recaptures that shoreline congealing around that sandbar, which is now a small gully. Sediment has actually accreted between the sandbar and the shoreline and has created nearly 550 meters of new land. Well, water, water everywhere is the Coleridge quote from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Inundation is the most common 9-foot project landscape transformation on the upper Mississippi. In this final section of the transformed ecological landscape, we'll take a look at inundated landscapes and the potential wetland habitat it creates. In this photo, we can see a low-lying, we can see an old cabin that is that shows low-lying inundation. This type of low-lying inundation is seasonal. Inundation like this happens every year, but in dry summers it will recede. This next set shows a second form of well-watered ground, which is complete inundation. The original photo 390 here was taken late in the process of the 9-foot project, and the landscape already shows inundation from the just completed Pool 17 dam. During the 1930s, the land was leased by the Skidmore family, William and Mabel May, and we can see Mabel and young son Gilbert walking down the road. Note how the water has moved past the tree line in what was a pasture. The upper Mississippi River is critical habitat for migratory waterfowl. According to Ducks Unlimited, the upper Mississippi River flyway funnels more waterfowl to their wintering grounds than any other flyway. Year-long high water fills forest sloughs and floods abandoned farm fields. This creates some amazing wetland habitat. During the winter, bald eagles make their eyries along backwater sloughs where small whitefish breed and die by the thousands. These fish become easy food for fledglings. Hundreds of thousands of mallards, canvasbacks, wood ducks, and Canadian geese make their fall and winter homes there. It's not uncommon to see a phalanx of pelicans take flight. In landscapes where bluff topography functions as a steep levee, as here in Pool 18, the sloughs can be deep and consistent. These backwater sloughs are habitat for bald eagles, and in this portion of the upper Mississippi River, this is a critical area. I've stopped counting the number of eagles I see on each trip. I listen for them though. They chirp when I'm near their nests, and it's a sound that I've grown to take as a warning. Someone is coming, stay alert. The chirping puts me on notice, and I don't want to blunder, again, I've done it before, into an incident where I scare a couple of eagles into spreading their massive wings and pointing their talons my way. Well, with that, I'd like to move on now to the next chapter of this book and examine how the 9-Foot Project transformed the human upper Mississippi landscape. The 9-Foot Project changed the way people used and interacted with the upper Mississippi River. Water rose in the fertile floodplain. Independent loggers and mussel harvesters lost their mills and fishing grounds. Landowners were given months to leave. They were given compensation, but they had to begin elsewhere. Depression-era squatters did not have that option, nor did many tenant farmers and sharecroppers who worked other people's lands along the floodplain. Small-town waterfronts were forced to pile high levees against increasing floodwaters. Cooperative drainage districts had to levee up as well as more and more water back into their fields. Federal authority in standing water, in other words, worked to dissolve communities. But of course, the public kept using the river. Riverside homes have given way to seasonal recreation cabins and public marinas. In the fall, a mighty migration of duck and deer hunters infiltrate quiet forests and islands. Fishermen are found year-round, sometimes trolling along in john boats, other times hunkered over a hole in the ice. And yes, some people still do live along the river, unprotected by levees and forever wary of high water. And so we'll begin here exploring the shift towards recreational landscapes. Well, the 9-Foot Project initiated a land use shift away from settled year-round use towards seasonal recreational landscapes. The Army Corps was not suited to manage the tens of thousands of acres the project, gave to them. So the Corps began leasing small strips of land for seasonal recreational use. This area here, just north of Michael Creek in Louisa County, is a leased recreation community all its own. Users lease land from the Army Corps of Engineers for an annual fee, and they can build on the land, though the Army Corps is indemnified from any damages to that property brought on by rising water. Build at your own risk. Nevertheless, it isn't hard to imagine a warm, humid summer night on a levee bordering the Mississippi River and families filling porches, frying catfish, and building deep and meaningful connections to place and each other. Those who could afford to lease could easily obtain shoreline access and 30-year guarantees. As such, the Corps contributed to a significant social reordering of the upper Mississippi shore. Those who could afford the lease could easily obtain shoreline access guarantees, as I said there. The Corps also dispersed lands to states and counties and townships and other federal management agencies. Those groups in turn built public recreation campsites, marinas, and river access points. And here's another example of this, of a public campground down by Keithsburg, Illinois. Well, as we know, the upper Mississippi floodplain was desirable agricultural land. Centuries of spring floods filled the landscape with silty loam. Early homesteaders flocked to the more elevated portions of the landscape, portions of the floodplain. But by the late 19th century, landowners formed cooperative drainage districts. They built levees and began pumping water from the floodplain, and they farmed. The 9-foot project largely put an end to farming inside the flood easement boundary. There were a few holdouts. Farmers that held title to their land were offered settlements for their land and property. Their substantial farmsteads were sold to the highest bidder for scrap material. If there were no bids, buildings were burned. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers simply had to vacate. Floodplain communities more or less disappeared. This next section examines the abandoned agricultural landscape. Well, there are dozens and dozens of examples of the abandoned agricultural landscape in the upper Mississippi forest. Like this one here on Huron Island in Pool 18. Sorry, once again, I'm buffering. Okay. Okay, so like I said, I doubt that, I mean, there are dozens of these types of examples out here, out in the floodplain, and I doubt that most people who pass by this spot really notice anything. Anything. They might see an old rusted out trash can, but trash and debris are so common here that they are almost invisible. But they might stumble across something else. Foundations in these landscapes linger, and I have to wonder about the amount of resources it took to build this house. It's on an island, and it must have been a great deal of work to get the concrete out there, to pour and build a foundation. In other words, it was meant to be permanent. There are many photos that show farms in various states of disrepair, clear examples of Depression-era poverty. This is not one of those, of course, but all of these homes, whether they were in poor disrepair or not, were homes, and they were peopled, and they were part of a community. And I know it sounds weird to say it that way, that these were peopled places, but now mostly they're not. And while I see lots of evidence of people in the region when I'm out there, trash and the occasional hunting stand, I almost never see human beings. In fact, I could probably count the number on one hand, the number of people that I've seen. So despite this great depopulation, large-scale agriculture is still practiced on the margins bordering the 9-foot project land. It's highly productive land when it remains dry, but that happens less and less these days. So I want to take a very quick look at this continuing agricultural legacy. Many farmers use levees and they provide protection in most years. Others expanded and deepened drainage ditches to move water off their fields quickly, like this ditch here on the Copperas Creek in Rock Island County. The farmland on either side of the ditch is of high value, so to protect that land from the 9-foot project, the Army Corps and the drainage districts built the Copperas Creek levees up. and high-value farmland was allowed to exist on the floodplain and not taken by eminent domain. These photos give us some sense of how wide the channel is between the levees. The repeat photo gives us a clear view of these levees on the both sides. And note that channelization is happening in the new photo there, which can be seen on the north bank here on the right of the photo. And as that erosion continues, it will also undermine the levee. Well, there are other types of transformed human landscapes, but because of the buffering issues here, I'm running short of time here. So I will leave those, and if you would like to explore some of these things, the industrial shoreline, transportation systems, and a thing that I call the levee effect, I will let you explore some of those things on my website. But I want to fast forward ahead to kind of my last chapter on this in this work here. So I'll conclude here what has really become one of my favorite parts of Two Mississippi, and it's a chapter I call Ghosts on the Landscape. One of the main goals of this research is to confront those first feelings that I had when I was on that riverboat so long ago, and I was looking out my window at the shorelines, and they seemed like wilderness to me. My research has given evidence to a lively and robust human and ecological community on the Upper Mississippi, both historically and perhaps less so now. But it is hidden. Ultimately, this book and this research seeks to make this hidden place identity visible again, to bring to light the ghosts in the landscape, and to give a voice to the Upper Mississippi's Depression-era places, people, and customs. The ultimate goal of this book and this research is to once again return the public to this landscape by telling its human and ecological story and inviting readers to explore the past. And it really all begins with this bed frame. So this is one of the first photos that I ever tried to reshoot. And I remember clearly flipping through the photo books at the Rock Island Arsenal and seeing this photo. And I was struck by this young couple's smiles and by the glass in the windows and the sense. And I guess, you know, this is a Depression shack, and the owners, we found out, were squatters. They were mussel harvesters. But they had turned this shack into a home, this little shack here on the shore. And this photo was taken right as the Mississippi was beginning to fill. There wasn't time here. Their time here at this place wasn't very long. They didn't have very much time left. And so with a colleague of mine, Reuben Heine, from the Geography department with me, we went out looking for this. It was one of the first trips, and we found it, or really Reuben found this site. I was busy with a metal detector a bit of ways away, trying to exactly locate a water pump on the site. My back was turned to this scene, and I heard a yelp and then Reuben hitting the ground. And I thought, oh my God, he broke his leg. And it's a long hike back. This is one of those islands where the shoreline is significantly grown. But he was okay, and he called me over. He said, Matt, come over here, check this out. And that brings us back to this bed frame, buried in 80 years of sediment, left by this family of squatters, probably unable to move such a big thing off the island in time to clear out. Reuben had tripped over it. It blended into the ground. And I really wonder to this day if anyone has ever seen this bed frame in all that time, in that 80 years. So a part of my mission with this research became clear: to once again return the public to this landscape by telling its human and ecological story and inviting readers to explore its past. And so with just a couple minutes here, I want to tell one more story. This one is about the Walker family from Yankee Slough in the bottoms of Port Louisa. In August, I got a phone call, August of 2019, I got a phone call in my office. It was Sally Jondal Walker. She had just returned from a doctor's appointment with her dad, Sam, and this is Sam right here. They'd been talking about the old house in Yankee Slough, and she wanted to know if I could take them out there again. I didn't hesitate, although I probably should have. It was the week before classes began, and the college mandated that we attend seminars and meetings. Heck yeah, I can come. What time? Now, I had met the Walker extended family through a crazy moment of pure serendipity. One afternoon in July, I experienced one of the most amazing potlucks I'd ever been to, and I began an oral history of their family's life in the Yankee Slough Bottoms. Well, that morning, I arrived at a boat ramp 20 minutes early, and I busied myself with cameras and voice recorders and GPS units. Sam and his family looked surprised to see me when they got there. We had a bet the professor would be late, they said. Looks like I lost. They had a rough idea, They had a rough idea where their old house once stood. They knew it was on Yankee Chute, of course. They had not far from the levee. We loaded into 2 flat-bottom John boats. The lead boat was captained by Sam's grandson, Kurt. I threw on a life preserver and I made myself comfortable. Sally introduced me to Lila, who was Sam's sister, and to Dwayne and Tim, her son and grandson, respectively. Sam narrated the entire trip to the chute. At Sand Run, he pointed out an old scar of a bridge that used to connect the bluff with the bottomlands. At Goose Pond, Sam told us that they used to run livestock here. It couldn't be farmed because it was too wet. The animals and the brush and the grass ate it down, and they could call the area cleared. Over by Horseshoe Bend, there was a big grove of pecan trees until the government men, quote, took them out. Well, Yankee Chute was once a natural Mississippi River channel. It likely was centuries ago the true shoreline, and years of sediment accretion actually added on to this area. Floods brought new sand and silt into the chute, and settlement brought man-made levees and pumping stations. And by the beginning of the 20th century, the Louisa County Drainage District piled sand and stone high up on Yankee Chute's mouth and severed its connection with the Mississippi. Speculators fell upon the drained bottomland, built houses, and hired out tenant farmers to clear the land and plant fields. The Walkers were one of those tenant farmers. Well, we parked the boats as close as we could and got out. Does this look familiar, Dad? Asked Sally. Nope. I kept my eyes to the GPS and kept moving. The entire forest floor was covered with new and sprouted maple saplings. I don't remember any trees in the yard, said Sam. Everything was just sand. He paused. They didn't have to have a lawnmower. Sam, it was Lila. Do you remember the fields all along up that way? I turned back to see her point away from the chute. There was fields all down here. There wasn't no brush along the lake. You could drive right along there, said Sam. And he was right. We walked along a small lateral indentation in the landscape, clear evidence of an old dirt roadbed. Well, in May 1940, an Army Corps survey crew came to the houses all along the chute. The group leader was short and compact and wore a dark leather jacket against the cool spring air. His crew fanned out over the property. They found property corners and outbuildings and barns and took photos of each to be entered as evidence in the upcoming condemnation cases. Sam's mother, Neva, was terrified of the government men, but Sam ran up to their car and jumped on the side rail before it came to a complete stop. I can remember that, Sam laughed. I felt nervous. Sam laughed, and I felt my nervous anxiety start to fall from my shoulders. Words and memories began to connect the walkers to the landscape. And those people that were trying to get rid of everyone come down here. I take them out and show them all the fish my daddy had in the live well. Mom was scared to death. Another laugh. Someone's going to haul him off to jail. But I talked to any of them, no matter how much she'd scold me. Any of them come down there, boy, I was out there to tell them everything. And Lila shook her head. And they never did get mad at you for doing that, did they, darling boy? He replied, the more they told me not to tell, the more I could remember to tell them. Well, in the official Army Corps photo taken on May 2nd, 1940, we see 4 large oak trees framing a 2-story tar-papered house. A sagging porch covers 2/3 of the facade. A disassembled cast iron stove sits in the corner of the porch, waiting to be removed. It's easy to imagine that the house was built in stages. A 2-story addition connects the porch. It's also down to tar paper and studs. A chicken pecks from the sandy front yard. In the center of the building is a tall brick chimney. And my GPS beeps. I've arrived at the house and everyone behind me grows quiet. The scene in the photo bears no resemblance. The scene that we're at bears no resemblance to the photo. Tall old maples line the shore and the sandy soil is covered with 1,000 maple seedlings. It all feels small and suddenly claustrophobic. In my mind, I begin to cobble together a story to assure them that yes, this is indeed the place, though no visual evidence seems to exist. I started to tell them about how the Army Corps sold off the houses for spare parts and then burned what was left in place. I explained that the consistent high water has eroded the banks and pulled the old oaks into the chute. It's not uncommon for all the cleared areas to fill in with maple trees and become unrecognizable. It's expected, actually. It's been 80 years after all. And everyone else kind of fanned out in their own separate directions there. Their eyes combed the ground for any evidence of this tenant house that lived on only in their family lore. Their search masked their disappointment. And then we found the chimney. And I apologize again that this is blurry here for you all here. But single bricks, I'll describe it here, single bricks with crumbling mortar had fallen in place and lay in piles, their red clay bricks obscured by moss and tall weeds. At the center of a pile was one solid 3-foot tall section of chimney, which rose from the mud and maple like a miniature ziggurat. We gathered around and picked up bricks. They wanted souvenirs for their mantles and front flower beds. They wanted to take a piece of this crumbled memory home with them. And so the walkers fanned out and each claimed their prize. Except for Sam. Sam looked at the pile and then turned around and lowered himself down. He sat on the chimney with his cane held before him with 2 hands. He was quiet. Lila came up from behind him and stood next to him. And it passed like that for minutes. A cardinal and a breeze in the trees were the only sound. Then Sam cleared his throat and looked up, said, "Well, it wasn't very big. Probably might have been 3 rooms upstairs, downstairs, 2 up." I showed him the picture. I remember this one having that tar paper siding on it, that brick siding. And the pictures you show them have tar paper. Well, they were probably stripped. Well, I was also just a little kid, he said. Well, we spent that day around the slough and I listened to the stories they told. And since then, we've kept contact and they've been an invaluable resource for me as I conduct more oral histories. It seems like they're related to just about everyone from around that area. But for a long time, I had one big regret. You know, there's not a lot of locals in the Army Corps photos. It wasn't what they needed to shoot, so they didn't capture locals in the photos. And I wish dearly that of all the photos that I had, I could find one with Sam and Lila in it, but I couldn't. I found their dad, Custer. Here's Custer leaning up against an outbuilding, and that was cool. But I really wished I could find Sam and Lila, but it just wasn't there, I thought. Well, one night I got a text from a student of mine, a student that was working on the walkers with me, thanks to the Schwiebert Fund. And she said, "Dr. Fockler, look behind the porch in 227. Now!" Exclamation point. And so I did. I ran to my computer and I opened it up. And there they were, 2 small faces sitting where their mom could see them, where they would be out of the way. And so with that, I'll conclude here. I'm happy to answer any questions of you, and I would love for you to further explore this project at my website. There's so much more of it out there, but I'd love to answer any questions for you. And if you'd like to talk about any of this, please let me know. All of my contact information is on the website, or you can just reach me at Augustana College. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Absolutely fascinating. And really, I love that last picture of the 2 small children, whew, from the far past. That was great. We have one question that's come in. Julie Tallman asks, how do we order your book?
Well, first I have to get it published. So, you know, right, this is a long stage, a long process of this. Right now, I hope to be done with this process with all of the field research that I want to complete here. Again, I have to kind of wait for winter to finish that up here, so I'm kind of anxiously watching the leaves fall and getting ready for my last kind of field season out here. As I'm doing that, I'm still working with families and reaching out to others to try and connect with them to get their stories on the landscape here as well too, and working with the archival stuff. That's a really long way of saying that I've got a book proposal ready, and I'm just kind of sitting on it until I can get it out there. So it might be another year or two, but instead, feel free to go to the 2-Mississippi website. There's a lot of stories that I'm posting up there, kind of using that as a trial run for the book.
Yeah, that sounds like a good way to keep tabs on you and watch for when that book comes out. And for our attendees, there is a Q&A chat window. You should have an icon with some thought bubbles or with a question mark, and that's the Q&A chat window if you wanted to submit any further questions. Julie also asks, do you have a publisher, and have you ever heard of Ice Cube Press?
Yeah, not yet. I do not have a publisher yet. I have a few in mind that I would like to go with. I think I have not heard of Ice Cube Press, but I'll be happy to take a peek at it.
Sounds like she's on that kind of stuff, which would be great. I'm gonna throw a question in here for you, Matt. It was much more toward the beginning of your slides where it looked like someone had carved into birch trees or something. There was a do you know what those were?
So that was one day. So that's on an island that is just on the kind of the opposite side of Buffalo, Iowa. And it's it was a really strange thing. Like so I took those photos in March, and I was kind of trying to chase, the floodwaters coming up. COVID was becoming a thing, and I realized I only had probably another day or couple of days of field research. So I was really trying to rush through. It wasn't an ideal day. It was cold and stormy and kind of raining and foggy. And I was on this island, and I was really trying to hustle around. And I came across to this beach on the other side there. And I thought, wow, this is a really cool old sandy beach. And I looked off and I saw something that looked like this carving there. And so I went down there. And and sometimes in those situations, when you're kind of in the forest by yourself like that, you can creep yourself out, And so I had successfully creeped myself out there, and I walked forward to there, and I realized what it was is that, I think for probably I don't know, maybe a decade or so at least, someone, maybe a group of people, have come ashore there and pulled some driftwood or some log up there and carved an animal in each one of them. And I could see, first it kind of creeped me out when I recognized all these like animal totems there, but once I saw that each one had a name on, or a number, like 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, I realized like I could kind of envision like this was some kind of like annual, like, beach party, kind of a summer, maybe one night, rather than Burning Man, we're going to, carve a man or carve an animal type of thing there too. So
okay, yeah, they look kind of interesting. I was wondering whether they were historic, but apparently more contemporary. Got a couple more questions here. Excuse me. Have you given the data that you found back to the Army Corps? Maybe in some ways they could manage the land for recreational use or ecological management?
Yeah, so I haven't given it yet, but I absolutely plan to. So Joe Lund, who is the supervisory forester here at the for the Army Corps here, he's stationed up in Pool 14, but for the Rock Island, he and Bob Romick, the librarian, have been the two that have really encouraged me through this process. And I think Joe is very, very keen. He's in the process right now of rewriting a shoreline and forest management plan. And he's just been really, really supportive. They both have of this project, and I absolutely intend to give them. I want to really all of the GIS data, which I didn't, present so much in this thing because it can be a little, it can be a little, I don't know, granular perhaps. All of the GIS data will be handed over to Joe. Like that's, I think. It's not, we don't have a deal for that or anything like that, but I want this to be something that could be used for management there. So yeah, so again, for Dina, who asked that question, that'll be coming up. He and I have talked several times, and I've shared photos and kind of some preliminary ideas there.
That's good. And it looks like we got one from Russ here. What camera or lens did you use for the restaged photos? And do you know what they used back then?
So this has been a real journey for me as far as trying to figure out what cameras they used. I wish I could go back in my screen and show you, but I don't have records. We don't have records of the types of cameras that they used. All I have are images of the cameras, and really most of those images are just shadows in there. So I have asked, I have spent hours and digging into different types of camera types that might be used, that were federally owned at that time. And then I have ultimately asked some experts, and I apologize, I can't quote exactly what type of large format box camera it was, but it was a tripod box camera there. And so what I did is I finally found on a message board someone who was fairly sure that this is what it was, and he talked to me about the types of settings that I might use on my camera, which is just oh my goodness, I'm spacing on it. It's sitting right over here. It's just a Sony oh my gosh, SLR camera. I can't remember exactly what it is, what the numbers are off the top of my head here. Oh my goodness, I see that someone posted in the chat that one of the cameras is on the 4th floor. Yep. Thing. Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, so I feel fairly confident about the types of lenses that I use in the camera to kind of gather the right depth of field with the photos.
Yeah. Just to clarify, someone commented, some anonymous watcher here, one of the cameras that was used maybe is up on the 4th floor of the clock tower over on the Arsenal in a museum exhibit
yeah.
About Henry Bossy or Boss.
That's not great.
Sure that's the camera. So is Henry one of the people that was listed as one of the photographers?
He was one of the core photographers for sure. He was kind of did a lot of the filming, one of the heads of that department. Yes.
Okay. Great. So you're going to go over there and seek out a camera.
Absolutely.
David asks, does historical geography go further back in time than you have studied, or would that be archaeology?
Yeah, so that's the beauty of doing historical geography. No, for sure. So there's definitely a lot of overlap right there, but yeah, I mean, we go back, into historical geography can look at any the evolution of place over time, right? And it doesn't necessarily even have to be really about human evolution of that place over time. So you could think of historical geography just as a lens in which, you know, you can examine any place and its evolution across over time. And yeah, many other disciplines, you know, I'm sure overlap and kind of cross in with this discipline, historical archaeology and, you know, environmental history as well too. So yeah, so really just that kind of it's about, we focus on place and not necessarily more specifically as maybe historians might focus on an event in time or people over time in there. You know, anthropologists might focus on, historical anthropologists more like people over time. You know, we're more about just focusing on that place.
Great. And I can put you in touch with Anthony, who was our anonymous
Excellent, thank you.
clock tower guy, and he says that Henry's photos are at the Smithsonian now, but many are are on display over at the clock tower building, I guess, or wherever Anthony's office is these days. So that's pretty interesting. Great. So unless we have some more questions, tell us one more time what your website is and where we can await the publication.
So it's twomississippi.com. So TWO-Mississippi.com. Yeah, like again, like if anyone wants to chat about any of this, you know, I am very, very open and excited to talk about this at any time. You know, one thing that I will add into here that one way in which I'm looking at this is not just kind of stopping talking to like closing off talking to people you know, who came from that landscape, from the shorelines at that time. I'm really also interested too in ways in which people now you know, kind of connect with place on the Upper Mississippi as well. I talked earlier, you know, in the talk about how we shifted away from these kind of agricultural, and if I would have had time to do some of the industrial stuff in there, you know, in industrial landscapes on the Upper Mississippi, and we've shifted over into more of a recreational landscape. Like I would love to talk to people who have summer cabins, who are Army Corps leasees, you know, and I would love to talk again about how they have, I'm not saying taken advantage of, that's not quite the right tone for this, but you know, how they have made use of this shift in landscape, right? And made use of the recreational opportunities there. So I'm open to talk, and I would love to talk to you. And so that offer is definitely out there.
And just another question from me. So you've not gone further upriver than Lock and Dam 15 at this point?
I know.
Are you planning to do any more?
Well, so I knew you were going to ask me this. I remember when we first talked about this like 6 months ago, you said something about Pool 13 or, you know, or something like that. I think it was.
The Clinton Pool up by Thompson where the
Sure, right. Well, here's what's happened with that, right? So the original plan, right, was to kind of go from 13 down to 18. But a couple of things have happened, right? First and foremost, you know, I lost almost an entire field season in 2019. We had really bad winter, really cold winter, too cold for me to go out with my camera even. And then that transitioned almost immediately into our record floods, you know? And so the water was high in the entire winter season there. So I lost a full year. That pushed me back from that time period. Then COVID, and you know, and so that kind of you know, I lost some time. I lost probably half of a field season as a result of COVID. So right now I think we're stopping right around, you know, kind of the 15 and down type of thing. I apologize for that, but you know, I'm in the running for some larger grants, and if that happens and I can kind of get some other eyes on the field, then we'll get your area done first. So
it can be the sequel.
Yes, exactly. To Mississippi.
Great. Well, again, very interesting. I know when we talked originally about having you at our conference and you kind of give us a preview, it just looked like a fascinating study. So thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Well, thanks, and I apologize for the technical difficulties, but that's, again, the world we're living in nowadays.
Yes, it is. We've got most of them. So. And we didn't crash. We're still here. So,
Yes.
so go visit Matt's website, and if you know good contacts or you yourself have riverfront store, or yeah, riverfront stories,
Mm-hmm.
get in touch. And at River Action, I've got his contact info too, if you forget where to find Matt, at Augustana. But I think that's it for the questions. So we will sign off and thank everyone for attending. And we've got most people still hanging on here, so you got a good audience.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for putting up with all that.
No problem. Thanks, Matt. Bye-bye.